Before we further investigate accumulation, or the reconversion of surplus value into capital, we must brush on one side an ambiguity introduced by the classical economists. Just as little as the commodities that the capitalist buys with a part of the surplus value for his own consumption serve the purpose of production and of creation of value, so little is the labor that he buys for the satisfaction of his natural and social requirements, productive labor. Instead of converting surplus value into capital, he, on the contrary, by the purchase of those commodities and that labor, consumes or expends it as revenue. In the face of the habitual mode of life of the old feudal nobility, which, as Hedel rightly says, consists in consuming what is in hand, and more especially displays itself in the luxury of personal retainers, it was extremely important for bourgeois economy to promulgate the doctrine that accumulation of capital is the first duty of every citizen, and to preach without ceasing that a man cannot accumulate if he eats up all his revenue. Instead of spending a good part of it in the acquisition of additional productive laborers, who bring in more than they cost. On the other hand, the economists had to contend against the popular prejudice that confuses capitalist production with hoarding, and fancies that accumulated wealth is either wealth that is rescued from being destroyed in its existing form, from being consumed, or wealth that is withdrawn from circulation. Exclusion of money from circulation would also exclude absolutely its self-expansion as capital, while accumulation of a hoard in the shape of commodities would be sheer tomfoolery. The accumulation of commodities in great masses is the result either of overproduction or of a stoppage of circulation. It is true that the popular mind is impressed by the sight, on the one hand, of the mass of goods that are stored up for gradual consumption by the rich, and on the other hand, by the formation of reserve stocks, the latter, a phenomenon that is common to all modes of production, and on which we shall dwell for a moment when we come to analyze circulation. Classical economy is therefore quite right when it maintains that the consumption of surplus products by productive, instead of by unproductive laborers, is a characteristic feature of the process of accumulation. But at this point the mistakes also begin. Adam Smith has made it the fashion to represent accumulation as nothing more than consumption of surplus products by productive laborers, which amounts to saying that the capitalizing of surplus value consists in merely turning surplus value into labor power. Let us see what Ricardo says. It must be understood that all the productions of a country are consumed, but it makes the greatest difference imaginable whether they are consumed by those who reproduce, or by those who do not reproduce another value. When we say that revenue is saved and added to capital, what we mean is that the portion of revenue, so said to be added to capital, is consumed by productive instead of unproductive laborers. There can be no greater error than in supposing that capital is increased by non-consumption. The part of revenue of which it is said it has been added to capital is consumed by productive laborers. The annual process of reproduction is easily understood, so long as we keep in view merely the sum total of the year's production. But every single component of this product must be brought into the market as a commodity, and there the difficulty begins. The movements of the individual capitals and of the personal revenues cross and intermingle and are lost in the general change of places. In the circulation of the wealth of society, this dazes the sight and propounds very complicated problems for solution. In the third part of Book II, I shall give the analysis of the real bearings of the fact. It is one of the great merits of the physiocrats that in their tableau économique they were the first to attempt to depict the annual production in the shape in which it is presented to us after passing through the process of circulation. In the last preceding chapter, we treated surplus value solely as a fund for supplying the individual consumption of the capitalist. In this chapter we have, so far, treated it solely as a fund for accumulation. It is, however, neither the one nor the other, but is both together. One portion is consumed by the capitalist as revenue, the other is employed as capital, is accumulated. Given the mass of surplus value, then the larger the one of these parts, the smaller is the other. Ceteris paribus, the ratio of these parts determines the magnitude of the accumulation. But it is by the owner of the surplus value, by the capitalist alone, that the division is made. It is his deliberate act. That part of the tribute exacted by him which he accumulates is said to be saved by him, because he does not eat it, because he performs the function of a capitalist and enriches himself. Except as personified capital, the capitalist has no historical value and no right to that historical existence, which, to use an expression of the witty Lichnowsky, hasn't got no date. and so far only is the necessity for his own transitory existence implied in the transitory necessity for the capitalist mode of production. But so far as he is personified capital, it is not values in use and the enjoyment of them, but exchange value and its augmentation, that spur him into action. Fanatically bent on making value expand itself, he ruthlessly forces the human race to produce for production's sake. He thus forces the development of the productive powers of society and creates those material conditions, which alone can form the real basis of a higher form of society, a society in which the full and free development of every individual forms the ruling principle. Only as personified capital is the capitalist respectable. As such, he shares with the miser the passion for wealth as wealth. But that which in the miser is a mere idiosyncrasy is, in the capitalist, the effect of the social mechanism, of which he is but one of the wheel. Moreover, the development of capitalist production makes it constantly necessary to keep increasing the amount of the capital laid out in a given industrial undertaking, and competition makes the immanent laws of capitalist production to be felt by each individual capitalist as external coercive law. It compels him to keep constantly extending his capital in order to preserve it, but extend it he cannot, except by means of progressive accumulation. So far, therefore, as his actions are a mere function of capital, endowed as capital is in his person with consciousness and a will, his own private consumption is a robbery perpetrated on accumulation, just as in bookkeeping by double entry, the private expenditure of the capitalist is placed on the debtor's side of his account against his capital. To accumulate is to conquer the world of social wealth, to increase the mass of human beings exploited by him, and thus to extend both the direct and the indirect sway of the capitalist. But original sin is at work everywhere. As capitalist production, accumulation, and wealth become developed, the capitalist ceases to be the mere incarnation of capital. He has a fellow feeling for his own atom, and his education gradually enables him to smile at the rage for asceticism as a mere prejudice of the old-fashioned miser. While the capitalist of the classical type brands individual consumption as a sin against his function, and as abstinence from accumulating, the modernized capitalist is capable of looking upon accumulation as abstinence from pleasure. Two souls, alas, do dwell within his breast, the one is ever parting from the other. Dr. Aiken says in a work published in The Trade of Manchester may be divided into 4 periods. First, when manufacturers were obliged to work hard for their livelihood. They enriched themselves chiefly by robbing the parents, whose children were bound as apprentices to them. The parents paid a high premium, while the apprentices were starved. On the other hand, the average profits were low, and to accumulate, extreme parsimony was requisite. They lived like misers, and were far from consuming even the interest on their capital. Even in the early part of the 8th century, a Manchester manufacturer, who placed a pint of foreign wine before his guests, exposed himself to the remarks and headshakings of all his neighbors. Before the rise of machinery, a manufacturer's evening expenditure at the public house where they all met never exceeded 6pence for a glass of punch and a penny for a screw of tobacco. It was not till, and this marks an epoch, that a person actually engaged in business was seen with an equipage of his own. The 4th period, the last years of the 8th century, is that in which expense and luxury have made great progress, and was supported by a trade extended by means of riders and factors through every part of Europe. What would the good Dr. Aiken say if he could rise from his grave and see the Manchester of today? Accumulate, accumulate. That is Moses and the prophets. Industry furnishes the material which saving accumulate. Therefore save, save, reconvert the greatest possible portion of surplus value, or surplus product into capital. Accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake. By this formula classical economy expressed the historical mission of the bourgeoisie, and did not for a single instant deceive itself over the birth throes of wealth. But what avails lamentation in the face of historical necessity? If to classical economy the proletarian is but a machine for the production of surplus value, on the other hand, the capitalist is in its eyes only a machine for the conversion of this surplus value into additional capital. Political economy takes the historical function of the capitalist in bitter earnest. In order to charm out of his bosom the awful conflict between the desire for enjoyment and the chase after riches, Malthus, about the year, advocated a division of labor, which assigns to the capitalist actually engaged in production the business of accumulating, and to the other sharers in surplus value, to the landlords, the placemen, the beneficed clergy, and the business of spending. It is of the highest importance, he says, to to keep separate the passion for expenditure and the passion for accumulation. The capitalists, having long been good livers and men of the world, uttered loud cries. What exclaimed one of their spokesmen, a disciple of Ricardo, Mr. Malthus preaches high rents, heavy taxes, and so that the pressure of the spur may constantly be kept on the industrious by unproductive consumer. By all means, production on a constantly increasing scale, runs the shibboleth, but production will, by such a process, be far more curbed in than spurred on. Nor is it quite fair thus to maintain in idleness a number of persons, only to pinch others, who are likely from their characters, if you can force them to work with success. Unfair as he finds it to spur on the industrial capitalist, by depriving his bread of its butter, yet he thinks it necessary to reduce the laborer's wages to a minimum, to keep him industrious. Nor does he for a moment conceal the fact that the appropriation of unpaid labor is the secret of surplus value. Increased demand on the part of the laborers means nothing more than their willingness to take less of their own product for themselves and leave a greater part of it to their employers, and if it be said that this begets glut by lessening consumption, I can only reply that glut is synonymous with large profits. The learned disputation, how the booty pumped out of the laborer may be divided, with most advantage to accumulation, between the industrial capitalist and the rich idler, was hushed in face of the Revolution of July. Shortly afterwards, the town proletariat at Lyons sounded the tocsin of revolution, and the country proletariat in England began to set fire to farmyards and corn stacks. On this side of the Channel, Owenism began to spread, on the other side, Simonism and Fourierism. The hour of vulgar economy had struck. Exactly a year before Nassau W. Sr. discovered at Manchester that the profit of capital is the product of the last hour of the 12, he had announced to the world another discovery. I substitute, he proudly says, for the word capital considered as an instrument of production, the word abstinence. An unparalleled sample this of the discoveries of vulgar economy. It substitutes for an economic category a sycophantic phrase, voilà tout. When the savage, says Senior, makes bows, he exercises an industry, but he does not practice abstinence. This explains how and why, in the earlier states of society, the implements of labor were fabricated without abstinence on the part of the capitalist. The more society progresses, the more abstinence is demanded. In economic forms of society of the most different kinds, there occurs not only simple reproduction, but in varying degrees reproduction on a progressively increasing scale. By degrees, more is produced and more consumed, and consequently more products have to be converted into means of production. This process, however, does not present itself as accumulation of capital, nor as the function of a capitalist, so long as the laborer's means of production, and with them his product and means of subsistence, do not confront him in the shape of capital. Richard Jones, who died a few years ago, and was the successor of Malthus in the chair of political economy at Haileybury College, discusses this point well in the light of two important facts. Since the great mass of the Hindu population are peasants cultivating their land themselves, their products, their instruments of labor and means of subsistence never take the shape of a fund saved from revenue, which fund has, therefore, gone through a previous process of accumulation. On the other hand, the non-agricultural laborers in those provinces where the English rule has least disturbed the old system are directly employed by the magnates, to whom a portion of the agricultural surplus product is rendered in the shape of tribute or rent. One portion of this product is consumed by the magnates in kind, another is converted, for their use, by the laborers, into articles of luxury and such like things, while the rest forms the wages of the laborers, who own their implements of labor. Here, production and reproduction on a progressively increasing scale go on their way without any intervention from that queer saint, that knight of the woeful countenance, the capitalist, abstainer. The proportion in which surplus value breaks up into capital and revenue being given, the magnitude of the capital accumulated clearly depends on the absolute magnitude of the surplus value. Suppose that percent were capitalized in percent. Eaten up, the accumulated capital will be pound, or pound, according as the total surplus value has amounted to pound, or pound. Hence all the circumstances that determine the mass of surplus value operate to determine the magnitude of the accumulation. We sum them up once again, but only in so far as they afford new points of view in regard to accumulation. It will be remembered that the rate of surplus value depends, in the first place, on the degree of exploitation of labor power. Political economy values this fact so highly that it occasionally identifies the acceleration of accumulation due to increased productiveness of labor, with its acceleration due to increased exploitation of the laborer. In the chapters on the production of surplus value, it was constantly presupposed that wages are at least equal to the value of labor power. Forcible reduction of wages below this value plays, however, in practice too important a part for us not to pause upon it for a moment. It in fact transforms, within certain limits, the laborer's necessary consumption fund into a fund for the accumulation of capital. Wages, says John Stuart Mill, have no productive power, they are the price of a productive power. Wages do not contribute, along with labor, to the production of commodities, no more than the price of tools contributes along with the tools themselves. If labor could be had without purchase, wages might be dispensed with. But if the laborers could live on air, they could not be bought at any price. The zero of their cost is therefore a limit in a mathematical sense, always beyond reach, although we can always approximate more and more nearly to it. The constant tendency of capital is to force the cost of labor back towards this zero. A writer of the 8th century, often quoted already, the author of The Only betrays the innermost secret soul of English capitalism, when he declares the historic mission of England to be the forcing down of English wages to the level of the French and the Dutch. With other things he says naively, but if our poor will live luxuriously, then labor must of course be dear when it is considered what luxuries the manufacturing populace consume, such as brandy, gin, tea, sugar, foreign fruit, strong beer, printed linen, snuff, tobacco, and he quotes the work of a Northamptonshire manufacturer, who with eyes squinting heavenward moans, 20 years later an American humbug, the baronized Yankee. Benjamin Thompson followed the same line of philanthropy to the great satisfaction of God and man. His essays are a cookery book with receipts of all kinds for replacing by some succedaneum the ordinary dear food of the laborer. The following is a particularly successful receipt of this wonderful philosopher. With the advance of capitalistic production, the adulteration of food rendered Thompson's ideal superfluous. At the end of the and during the first 10 years of the 8th century, the English farmers and landlords enforced the absolute minimum of wage, by paying the agricultural laborers less than the minimum in the form of wages, and the remainder in the shape of parochial relief. An example of the waggish way in which the English Dogberries acted in their legal fixing of a wages tariff. The squires of Norfolk had dined, says Mr. Burke, when they fixed the rate of wages. The squires of Berks evidently thought the laborers ought not to do so, when they fixed the rate of wages at Speenhamlin. There they decide that income should be. For a man, when the gallon or half-peck loaf of pounds is at, and increase regularly till bread is. When it is above that, some decrease regularly till it be at, and then his food should be divided by th less. Before the Committee of Inquiry of the House of Lords, a certain A. Bennet, a large farmer, magistrate, poor law guardian, and wage regulator, was asked the part played in our days by the direct robbery from the laborer's necessary consumption fund in the formation of surplus value, and therefore of the accumulation fund of capital, the so-called domestic industry has served to show. Further facts on this subject will be given later. Although in all branches of industry that part of the constant capital consisting of instruments of labor must be sufficient for a certain number of laborers, it by no means always necessarily increases in the same proportion as the quantity of labor employed. In a factory, suppose that laborers' working hours a day yield working hours. If the capitalist wishes to raise this sum by 1/2, he can employ more workers, but then he must also advance more capital, not merely for wages, but for instruments of labor. But he might also let the laborers work hours instead of, and then the instruments of labor already to hand would be enough. These would then simply be more rapidly consumed. Thus additional labor, begotten of the greater tension of labor power, can augment surplus product and surplus value, without corresponding augmentation in the constant part of capital. The extractive industries, mines, and the raw materials form no part of the capital advanced. The subject of labor is in this case not a product of previous labor, but is furnished by nature gratis, as in the case of metals, minerals, coal, stone, and in these cases the constant capital consists almost exclusively of instruments of labor, which can very well absorb an increased quantity of labor. All other things being equal, the mass and value of the product will rise in direct proportion to the labor expended. As on the first day of production, the original produce formers, now turned into the creators of the material elements of capital, man and nature, still work together. Thanks to the elasticity of labor power, the domain of accumulation has extended without any previous enlargement of constant capital. In agriculture, the land under cultivation cannot be increased without the advance of more seed and manure. But this advance once made, the purely mechanical working of the soil itself produces a marvelous effect on the amount of the product. A greater quantity of labor, done by the same number of laborers as before, thus increases the fertility, without requiring any new advance in the instruments of labor. It is once again the direct action of man on nature which becomes an immediate source of greater accumulation, without the intervention of any new capital. Finally, in what is called manufacturing industry, every additional expenditure of labor presupposes a corresponding additional expenditure of raw materials, but not necessarily of instruments of labor. And as extractive industry and agriculture supply manufacturing industry with its raw materials and those of its instruments of labor, the additional product the former have created without additional advance of capital tells also in favor of the latter. General result: by incorporating with itself the two primary creators of wealth, labor power and the land, capital acquires a power of expansion that permits it to augment the elements of its accumulation beyond the limits apparently fixed by its own magnitude, or by the value and the mass of the means of production already produced in which it has its being. Another important factor in the accumulation of capital is the degree of productivity of social labor. With the productive power of labor increases the mass of the products, in which a certain value, and therefore a surplus value of a given magnitude, is embodied. The rate of surplus value remaining the same or even falling, so long as it only falls more slowly than the productive power of labor rises, the mass of the surplus product increases. The division of this product into revenue and additional capital remaining the same, the consumption of the capitalist may, therefore, increase without any decrease in the fund of accumulation. The relative magnitude of the accumulation fund may even increase at the expense of the consumption fund, whilst the cheapening of commodities places at the disposal of the capitalist as many means of enjoyment as formerly, or even more than formerly. But hand in hand with the increasing productivity of labor goes, as we have seen, the cheapening of the laborer, therefore a higher rate of surplus value, even when the real wages are rising. The latter never rise proportionally to the productive power of labor. The same value in variable capital therefore sets in movement more labor power, and therefore more labor. The same value in constant capital is embodied in more means of production, in more instruments of labor, materials of labor and auxiliary materials. It therefore also supplies more elements for the production both of use value and of value, and with these more absorbers of labor. The value of the additional capital, therefore, remaining the same or even diminishing, accelerated accumulation still takes place. Not only does the scale of reproduction materially extend, but the production of surplus value increases more rapidly than the value of the additional capital. The development of the productive power of labor reacts also on the original capital, already engaged in the process of production. A part of the functioning constant capital consists of instruments of labor, such as machinery, and which are not consumed, and therefore not reproduced, or replaced by new ones of the same kind, until after long periods of time. But every year, a part of these instruments of labor perishes, or reaches the limit of its productive function. It reaches, therefore, in that year, the time for its periodical reproduction, for its replacement by new ones of the same kind. If the productiveness of labor has, during the using up of these instruments of labor, increased, more efficient and cheaper machines, tools, apparatus, and replaced the old capital is reproduced in a more productive form, apart from the constant detail improvements in the instruments of labor already in use. The other part of the constant capital, raw material and auxiliary substances, is constantly reproduced in less than a year, those produced by agriculture, for the most part annually. Every introduction of improved methods, therefore, works almost simultaneously on the new capital and on that already in action. Every advance in chemistry not only multiplies the number of useful materials and the useful applications of those already known, thus extending with the growth of capital its sphere of investment. It teaches at the same time how to throw the excrements of the processes of production and consumption back again into the circle of the process of reproduction, and thus, without any previous outlay of capital, creates new matter for capital. Like the increased exploitation of natural wealth by the mere increase in the tension of labor power, science and technology give capital a power of expansion independent of the given magnitude of the capital actually functioning. They react at the same time on that part of the original capital which has entered upon its stage of renewal. This, in passing into its new shape, incorporates gratis the social advance made while its old shape was being used up. Of course, this development of productive power is accompanied by a partial depreciation of functioning capital. So far as this depreciation makes itself acutely felt in competition, the burden falls on the laborer, in the increased exploitation of whom the capitalist looks for his indemnification. Labor transmits to its product the value of the means of production consumed by it. On the other hand, the value and mass of the means of production set in motion by a given quantity of labor increase as the labor becomes more productive. Though the same quantity of labor adds always to its products only the same sum of new value, still the old capital value, transmitted by the labor to the products, increases with the growing productivity of labor. An English and a Chinese spinner may work the same number of hours with the same intensity, then they will both in a week create equal values. But in spite of this equality, an immense difference will obtain between the value of the week's product of the Englishman, who works with a mighty automaton, and that of the Chinaman, who has but a spinning wheel. In the same time as the Chinaman spins 1 pound of cotton, the Englishman spins several hundreds of pounds. A sum many hundred times as great of old value swells the value of his product, in which those reappear in a new, useful form, and can thus function anew as capital. As Frederick Engels teaches us, all the wool crop in England of the 3 preceding years lay untouched for want of laborers, and so it must have lain, if newly invented machinery had not come to its aid and spun it. Labor embodied in the form of machinery of course did not directly force into life a single man, but it made it possible for a smaller number of laborers, with the addition of relatively less living labor, not only to consume the wool productively and put into it new value, but to preserve in the form of yarn and its old value. At the same time, it caused and stimulated increased reproduction of wool. It is the natural property of living labor to transmit old value whilst it creates new. Hence, with the increase in efficacy, extent and value of its means of production, consequently with the accumulation that accompanies the development of its productive power, labor keeps up and eternizes an always increasing capital value in a form ever new. This natural power of labor takes the appearance of an intrinsic property of capital, in which it is incorporated, just as the productive forces of social labor take the appearance of inherent properties of capital, and as the constant appropriation of surplus labor by the capitalists takes that of a constant self-expansion of capital. With a given degree of exploitation of labor power, the mass of the surplus value produced is determined by the number of workers simultaneously exploited, and this corresponds, although in varying proportions, with the magnitude of the capital. The more, therefore, capital increases by means of successive accumulations, the more does the sum of the value increase that is divided into consumption fund and accumulation fund. The capitalist can, therefore, live a more jolly life, and at the same time show more abstinence. And finally, all the springs of production act with greater elasticity, the more its scale extends with the mass of the capital advanced.